Good morning. This presentation has a lot of information. Turns out consciousness is a complex subject, so I'm just going to jump right in. Mankind's understanding of the universe and everything in it, including ourselves, has over time been shaped by our limited perceptual capacity. Our understanding of the world has evolved from caveman times through the Middle Ages to modern times as technology has shaped our worldview with ever more powerful telescopes, microscopes, and other apparatus facilitating the evolution of our understanding. Ours is the first generation that's been able to explore down to the very fabric of reality itself, allowing us to gain a level of understanding that has totally reset our conception of how things work. It is at this level that we have been able to explore the nature of consciousness. These new insights have practical implications for recovery and mental health. I've compiled my research on the matter, including over 36 hours of supporting reference material, video content by subject matter experts, into a book published in 2021 entitled Resolving Spiritual Skepticism in Recovery. And I recently finished a manuscript for a workbook study guide to facilitate its implementation in clinical settings. The clip we're about to see is from a presentation by Dr. Joe Dispenza, upon whom much of my work is based, showing how information affects neural activity in the brain in real time. He also shows how repetition over time increases the robustness of neural connections and neural networks. It doesn't take a rocket surgeon to see how this robustness in the addicted makes change for them more challenging. But I suppose that means job security for us, right? Let's have a look.
Synaptic connections. Every time you learn something new, this is what's happening in your brain, geniuses. If you learned one bit of information today, your brain did this. Boom. That's learning. Physical evidence as a result of your interaction in the environment. Every time you learn something in your brain, there's a physical change that takes place, and learning is making new connections. Are you with me? This is how fast it happens, too. That's learning. If you learn anything this week, you've made a footprint. If learning is making new synaptic connections, then if you keep firing the same thoughts over and over again, you're going to wire them in your brain. So then if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining them. And all of a sudden, they develop a long-term relationship. And just like any relationship, the more you communicate, the more they connect. And neurons are exactly the same way. Now, as you begin to learn information, neurons tend to assemble themselves into networks, or what's called neural networks. And neural networks are just gangs of neurons that have fired and wired together to form a community of neurosynaptic connections that's related to a thought, a skill, a habit, a behavior, a concept. And neural networks are automatic programs. You have a neural network to brush your teeth, to put on makeup, to speak a language, to walk. All of a sudden, those neurons then form a hardware circuitry, but if you keep repeating it, the hardware becomes a software program and it becomes automatic. So then, you want to see a thought? Watch. Boom, there's a thought. Right there. Watch again. Boom, that's a thought. You generate more electrical impulses in your brain in one day than all the cell phones on the planet put together. And it's not coming from the candy bar you just ate. You are connected to a greater field.
So why study consciousness at all? Well, among other things, consciousness is a component of spirituality. Over the years, as I attended AA meetings, I observed that those with any sense of spiritual devoutness seem to have an easier time establishing and maintaining long-term recovery than those without. As a clinician, I thought it would be useful to try and hack into whatever was behind this phenomena so that my patients, many of whom have real problems relating to a higher power, might derive some clinical benefits of spirituality. In the process, I found myself having to account for the concept of consciousness, as it appears to be an integral part of the communication loop between those with a belief in a higher power and their higher power. As an atheist myself at the time, I approached the spirituality problem from the angle of placebo effect, which can account for as much as 75% efficacy in medical studies. I didn't want to presuppose the existence of a higher power, as doing so would constitute a circular argument. My research led me down a 2-year-long rabbit hole. Here's an overview of my method. At its foundation is peer-reviewed science, which we'll be touching on shortly. Analysis of the science provides data relevant for application in cognitive restructuring. And then evidence-based practices are employed to administer the new information, resulting in a profound degree of cognitive restructuring, remarkable longevity, and depth of change in patients as they apply these principles in their recovery. This model is solid in that peer-reviewed research studies support both the science and the delivery methods of the extrapolated content. Let's have a quick look at the surface principles behind this change model. For the average person, 95% of the thoughts they have today are the same thoughts they had yesterday. They show up to our office with everything they know from their past, their experiences, their unquestioned beliefs about who they are, about their limitations, their past failed efforts to change, conditioning from their dysfunctional family of origin, and limiting beliefs about the world. They're stuck. The same old thoughts perpetuate the same choices, yielding the same behaviors, experiences, and emotions, which then reinform the same thoughts, and the circle repeats itself until the status quo is no longer sustainable, and they reach out to us. We then provide new information. Recovery content, literature, videos, TED Talks, etc. We point out cognitive distortions, blind spots in their thinking. We introduce them to experiential interventions like AA, groups, treatment, and so on. As a result of receiving this new information, their thoughts begin to change, and they start making different choices, resulting in new and different behaviors, which yields new experiences that generate new emotions, which then reinforce their desire to seek more new information. And over time, the client's life incrementally improves until the maintenance phase, where recovery information becomes internalized and new experiences reinforce the positive changes in their lives, recreating or creating a new healthy status quo. It's my belief that information is the key to this change process, and so we're going to get into some detail on the essential nature of information later on. Let's put on our science hats now and explore a major misperception that until recently has contributed to one of the beliefs patients have that perpetuates their addictions: control fallacy, or the idea that they're merely helpless victims of circumstances and therefore are not responsible for their choices and behaviors. Conventional wisdom until recently has been that at our most fundamental level, we're made up of tiny marbles, atoms, subatomic particles, that we're nothing more than mechanistic automatons whose behaviors can be accounted for by physical interaction with the environment and internally, as our neurons go about firing to create the illusion of consciousness. This premise creates the impression that everything merely bounces off everything else, implying that fundamental change requires significant time, effort, and is largely out of our hands as we bounce off our environment like a leaf in the stream of life. Unfortunately, this reductionistic model runs into a dead end once you get down to the subatomic level. After all, subatomic particles, of which we're made, don't want stuff, or aspire to be therapists, or to fall in love, or to write music that appeals to the masses. There was no proven science available to explain how aspiration, love, and intent could somehow coalesce into material reality until fairly recently, when that somehow was brought to light through physics, which is the study of reality. A cursory understanding of some elemental aspects of quantum physics helps to overcome the views held by most of our clients. Quantum field theory and information theory combine to make the most successful model of reality and of consciousness that we have to date. And it makes obvious that we are not, in fact, victims of our circumstances, but rather we create them. When patients internalize this information, they experience a fundamental shift in their mindset, favorably impacting their assessment of their future prospects for change, giving them hope. Remember when you were taught in high school that the three fundamental particles in an atom are a proton, neutron, and electron? While this is true, in the 70s it was discovered that protons and neutrons of an atom are comprised of smaller particles, quarks, which come in two varieties, up quarks and down quarks. I guess by the 70s, physicists ran out of fancy names for their subatomic particles, so there you go. Anyway, a proton consists of two up quarks and one down quark, and a neutron consists of two down quarks and one up quark. There's no test on this, so don't get too excited about memorizing it. Just relax and pick up what you can, and I'll be happy to answer any questions down the road. Of course, the electrons of an atom orbit the nucleus, as seen here, just like you learned in high school. But the important thing to understand is that any atom truly consists of only these three fundamental particles: up quarks, down quarks, and electrons. And it's astounding if you take a moment to think about that. Everything in the universe, you, me, your chair, the air, the sun, your pet, your ex, and everything are just slightly differing arrangements of only these three fundamental particles. Another way to put it would be to say that there's nothing in the universe that doesn't consist of only varying arrangements of these three subatomic particles, which raises some fascinating philosophical questions that we don't have time for today. But our science teachers did us a huge disservice in the form of an innocent yet fundamentally inaccurate depiction of the relative scale of the electron orbits around atomic nuclei, as you can see in the lower left-hand portion of the illustration to the right. This simple mischaracterization inadvertently has skewed our understanding of the universe and ourselves on an atomic level. And the implications for this error are astounding, making plausible the idea that consciousness is a core fundamental aspect of our being. Some may refer to it as the soul, others the ghost in the machine, but whatever you call it, it comprises a vast majority of our physical self, over 99.999999% to be precise. How is this so? Let's get a better idea of the volume of empty space that lies within an atom.
It's mostly empty.
We were all taught in school that the world is made of stuff, of matter, of mass, of atoms. Atoms make up molecules, molecules make up materials, and everything is made of that. But atoms actually are mostly empty. For example, if this ball were the nucleus of an atom, a proton in a hydrogen atom, for example, then the electron circling this, which would describe the outer limits of that atom, would be out by that mountain over there, roughly 20 miles away. And everything in between is empty. In fact, the universe is mostly empty. However, when we go down in scale, in the emptiness, we eventually come to a level, the fundamental level of space-time geometry, the fine basement level of the universe, where there's information, there's a pattern. It's called the Planck scale, and it's the fabric of the universe. And at that level, there's information that's been there since the Big Bang.
So, and this is a super important fact, right? Atoms in reality are about 1/10,000,000th matter and 99.999999% empty space. That should be remarkable to anyone to whom this information is news. Scientists have spent the last few decades studying the precise nature, though, of all of that empty space, and the results have been astounding and profound. Let's frame this new information a few different ways. If the nucleus of a hydrogen atom were blown up to the size of a golf ball, the electron could be in a sphere anywhere within a 1.5 mile radius. if you removed all the empty space from between all the atoms comprising the concrete, glass, and steel of the IDS tower in downtown Minneapolis, you'd be left with something the size of a tiny grain of rice weighing millions of tons. If you removed all the empty space from between all the subatomic particles making up all 7.5 or 8 billion, however many it is now, people on the planet, you'd end up with a clump of matter the size of a sugar cube. So you and I are barely more than holograms, yet modern medicine seems to focus only on the 1/10 millionth of us that's actual matter, ignoring the other 99.999999% of us that Eastern philosophy and placebo effects seem to leverage, which is a major focus in my practice. Now, let's dig down a bit more into the sub-basement level of reality to what all that empty space is really made of and how it works, and why this is so important as it relates to consciousness, cognitive restructuring, and ultimately behavioral change. So, where do all these fundamental particles come from, right? Quarks, electrons, etc. And what is the mechanism behind their appearance and their behavior? Well, these particles are derived from what lies in all of that empty space. What we've discovered is that at the sub-basement level of reality lie 17 immaterial fields, all enmeshed and interacting with each other to create what we refer to as reality, or the universe. It's important to understand that these immaterial fields are continuous and they're unbroken throughout space and time. They go throughout the entire universe. Atoms, we, and everything in the universe are derivative of these fields and how they interact. There are 3 basic types of fields: 12 scalar fields, which are the 3 columns to the left, 4 vector fields, which is the orange column, and the Higgs field, which was finally proven to exist in 2012, just over a decade ago. So here they are and how they work. As a general rule, scalar fields yield particles, quarks, electrons, etc. Tiny excitations or packets of energy called quanta in the scalar fields interact with the Higgs field, which is the mechanism whereby that energy, those packets of energy, are converted to matter or a particle. And once we have a particle, the vector fields then govern their behavior. For instance, the gluon field holds the quarks, up and down quarks together into protons and neutrons. Another field holds the protons and neutrons together into nuclei, and yet another governs the behavior of the electrons, creating atoms and allowing for the formation of molecules as the outer electron shells interact with each other, creating everyone and everything in the universe. If it were not for the vector fields, particles would simply just fly around willy-nilly and nothing would coalesce into anything. The universe would be very different if any of the values or aspects of this intricate field system differed in the least. So it is the fields or the field system that is ultimately fundamental to the architecture of the universe, not particles or matter. Here's a quick 2-dimensional animation of the quantum field fluctuations behind the formation of subatomic particles in the Higgs field. Let's have a look.
Where were we? To understand how the Higgs field works.
So again, we've got the standard model of particles there, and what happens is you have these perturbations or spikes of energy in the various fields, whether it's the photon field or the electron field or the quark field. When there are spikes of energy and there is enough energy there to interact with the Higgs field, you eventually get a particle. But remember that in the background there are always these what are called quantum vacuum fluctuations that are fluctuating just below the energy levels necessary to interact with the Higgs field. If you look at the upper left-hand corner here, for instance, of each of these boxes, it says the amount of energy necessary to interact with the Higgs field. An up quark requires 2.2 mega electron volts per square centimeter. A down quark requires exactly 4.7 megaelectron volts per square centimeter, no more or no less. So the only way to get 2 up quarks, for example, is to have energy spikes at a level of 4.4, right? Twice the amount of mega electron volts per square centimeter. So that's how that works. That's why they're called quanta, because they're specific quantities of energy required for each type of field in order to interact with the Higgs field. Now, notably in the background, again, there are all these what you call virtual particles, which are spikes of energy that are slightly beneath the level that's required to interact with the Higgs field. And this will be important a little bit later on as we discuss consciousness. But just understand that there are constant field fluctuations going on. So again, the unified field system, or energy and not particles, are architecturally fundamental to all material reality. There's a hierarchy here then, right? In which the immaterial field system and information, which we'll get to momentarily, are fundamental to everything. And then everything else is derivative of or epiphenomena of the immaterial field system. So where does consciousness fit into the picture? Let's try to define what consciousness is and is not. Consciousness is not matter, therefore it must be immaterial, or energy in other words. Consciousness has a singular perceptual vantage point. You have yours and I have mine. Consciousness has intent. Again, subatomic particles like quarks and electrons don't want stuff, right? They don't aspire to be pilots or therapists, to fall in love, etc. Consciousness has intent. Consciousness has a material impact on reality, which we'll see in a little bit, including the space between our ears and beyond. It affects matter. Remember those virtual particles whose energy level was just below that which would be sufficient to interact with the Higgs field? That phenomenon makes it such that the application of just slightly more energy, sympathetic wave energy in the form of intent, can push those virtual waves into a strong enough state where they inevitably interact with the Higgs field, enough to convert them to real particles. The dynamics between the field system on one hand and the singular focus of intent on the other makes mind over matter a very literal expression. But don't take my word for it. How did scientists prove this experimentally? Let's explore and witness this dynamic between energy and matter, which incidentally underlies neuroplasticity and thus behavioral change in our patients. There was a famous lab experiment done decades ago called the double slit experiment, which may be familiar to any physics nerds among you. That experiment caused scientists to further explore the direct relationship between consciousness and material reality. So let's have a look at the double slit experiment now.
And here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness. The infamous double slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So, when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched. And it was here that physicists stepped forever into the strange, never world of quantum events. What is matter? Marbles or waves? And waves of what? And what does an observer have to do with any of this? The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing.
Interesting, huh? So it's only upon observation, in other words, the application of directed or conscious energy, that undefined waves of energy are converted into particle state or material reality. This is only possible when subjective, intentional focus adds sufficient sympathetic energy to the field system to push sub-Higgs level wave energy into a level where it can interact with the Higgs field, forcing the formation of a particle. The reason physicists initially had trouble figuring out how their knowledge of the system could impact its state was because at the time they incorrectly imagined themselves as being separate from the apparatus. In other words, they failed to understand that both they and the apparatus are derivative of the selfsame field system, and thus the energy of their focus or observation was sufficient to change the state of the system from wave into particle, or from possibility into reality. In the absence of an observer, no particles are formed, leaving nothing but waves of potential. Now, you might say, well, that's all fine and dandy when we're all talking about a single subatomic particle stream in a laboratory. But the world is not a laboratory, and there are no slits in the world, which is much more complex than any lab apparatus. You wouldn't be the first to have thought of that. So let's have a look at how that plays out.
Velocity is unknowable, but unmeasured properties are not just uncertain, they are fundamentally undefined. One of the most profound illustrations of this is the famous double-slit experiment. If you aren't familiar, check out our previous episode that discusses it in detail. You might also want to catch up on the first two in our quantum field theory playlist, because we are going to be building on that. But the too long didn't watch for the double-slit experiment is this. A particle, say a photon or an electron, travels through a barrier containing two slits to a screen. Its initial and final positions are known, but what path does it take in between? Which slit does it go through? The interference pattern produced by particles on the screen can only be explained if each of them travels through both slits, not as a particle, but as a wave that fills the intervening space, interacts with itself, and defines the probability of that particle actually showing up at a given point on the screen. There's a story about a quantum mechanics professor explaining the double-slit experiment to a class. The prof showed how the locations of the particles on the screen can be calculated by adding the amplitude of a wave passing through one slit to the amplitude of a wave passing through the other slit. One impertinent student asked, "What happens if you cut a third slit in the barrier?" The professor replied, "Obviously you have to add together the amplitudes of waves passing through all three slits." The student pushed it. "But what if you add 4 slits? What about 5? To which the agitated professor repeated, "Add the amplitudes of 4 slits, 5 slits, etc. Feeling cocky, the student asked, "What about if you cut infinite slits, so there's no more screen? And then what if you add a second screen with infinite slits?" As the probably apocryphal story goes, that student was Richard Feynman, and he just outlined the basics of what was to become the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics. It was a simple idea, but it led to the most elegant formulation of quantum mechanics ever devised, and became a key to quantum field theory that in turn has provided us.
All right. So reality doesn't have slits, but it doesn't matter. The principle applies. Remember, all the science underlying this material is repeatable, and it has undergone research studies with thorough peer review. So let's set the consciousness stuff aside for just a minute and talk about information. The above equation describes, and given adequate data to plug into the variables, accurately predicts any phenomena you can imagine in the universe. We don't need to pretend to understand all the symbols nor what they mean. That's for way smarter folks than me. But you can see that it's chock full of information, and information is fundamental even to the field system upon which reality is built. Quantum information defines the laws governing the structure, the function, the behavior, and the dynamics of the unified field system. Let's have a look at information in relation to both consciousness and life itself. We're going to be introduced to two concepts in this next video, that of quantum information, upon which, again, the entire quantum field system is built and governed, and a thing called microtubules, the apparatus or physical mechanism by which quantum information appears to be translated and utilized by all living beings, even lower life forms. Early on in the video, The scientists use the term spontaneously when describing the formation of microtubules. I would argue that nothing so intricate coalesces spontaneously. Let's have a look.
I'm Stuart Hammeroff. I'm a retired anesthesiologist and director of the Center for Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona. I'm currently working as a research professor in the Arizona Astrobiology Center, looking for the origin of life and consciousness. I actually got interested in consciousness in a cancer lab studying cell division, mitosis, how cells divide and the chromosomes are pulled apart by structures called mitotic spindles, which turned out to be microtubules, which I'd never heard of before. They're basically polymers of a protein called tubulin, and they will spontaneously assemble into these beautiful cylindrical lattices. At that moment, microtubules were discovered to also be in neurons. So the brain was full of microtubules, and they're uniquely arranged in parts of the neuron, the dendrites and the soma, completely different than they are in all other biology. I went on to move to Arizona, met the chair of the anesthesiology department. He said, come to your residency. You can investigate how anesthesia works to selectively prevent consciousness, which nobody understands. And he handed me a paper by a friend of his showing that anesthesia depolymerized microtubules, which are these structures that I'd become interested in. One thing about anesthesia that's really interesting and hard to explain is that it only affects consciousness while other brain activities continue. And my work in anesthesia has shown that anesthesia works pretty much the same on all animals and even plants. So that tells me that consciousness is probably biologically the same.
An interesting question is if anesthetics can have an influence on plants, like this Venus flytrap.
Well, most people in neuroscience, philosophy, psychology would say the brain is a complex computer of simple neurons. And in a computer, you have enough bits of 1 or 0. You hook them up by connections, put in input and get an output. They're not realizing or don't consider that a single cell organism doesn't have any synapses. It's not in a network. It's not in a multicellular system. It's just one cell. And its microtubules act as its nervous system. And I think the microtubules act as the nervous system for all cells. So if a paramecium or an amoeba can be clever, I think it's an insult to neurons to say that they're a simple 1 or a 0. And then in the 80s, several prominent books came out, like this book by Roger Penrose. The first half of the book argued against the idea that consciousness was a computation. Roger argued that this meant that things like understanding needed something outside the computational system of the brain. And for that, he brought in quantum mechanics and quantum physics. At small scales, particles can be waves. So a particle can be in 2 or more places at the same time. It can be here, 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 like a wave, or just here and here, in what's called quantum superposition. But Rogers said that the separation in space-time is unstable. And after a time, given by a very simple equation, the uncertainty principle, it would collapse to one or the other. And when that happened, and here was the kicker, it would give a moment of conscious experience, a proto-conscious experience. And it's happening not only in our brains, but it's happening in the environment, in the table, everywhere at a very microscopic level. But one issue we have in consciousness is how do we have something at a very, very tiny scale up to one collective conscious thought at a time as opposed to a gazillion different things going on. And I thought of it as kind of like if you go to the symphony, before they start playing, all the musicians are tuning their instruments. To a non-musician like me, it sounds like noise. And then they start playing Brahms, Beethoven, the Beatles, whatever, and it's music. So the difference between the proto-conscious noise and the music is what the brain does to these objective reductions that are everywhere in the environment. And for that, you need some kind of instrument, something that can organize or orchestrate. But Roger said, I don't know what it is. And I read this book and I said, damn, he's talking about microtubules. He needs them. And I wrote him a letter. I told him about microtubules, and I said, I'm going to be in England for a meeting. I'd love to come by and talk to you about this. He said, please do. So I got on the train from London and went to Oxford and met him. And we just started talking about microtubules and consciousness and developing our theory. I invited him to the first consciousness conference I was planning, the Science of Consciousness, which I've organized at the University of Arizona for the last 30 years. This was the first one in 1994.
But what about consciousness? What do I mean by that? Well, I'm not going to attempt to define it, because I think it would be a mistake to try and define it.
If you go into the microtubules and into the quantum world, then you get non-locality.
There is something outside the computational laws of physics.
People say, well, you got to define consciousness, but we also have to define life. I'm also interested in life and evolution, and I've come to the conclusion that life, even very simple life, needs consciousness. Otherwise, why have all this purposeful behavior? What's the point? And I wrote a paper about it, and about 2 years ago, I got an email from Dante Loretta, who had been in charge of a NASA program called OSIRIS-REx.
Status check.
Go Atlas.
Go Centaur.
Go OSIRIS-REx.
10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And liftoff of OSIRIS-REx.
OSIRIS-REx is a mission in NASA's New Frontiers program, where we built a spacecraft to rendezvous with a near-Earth asteroid named Bennu, survey it in great detail, collect a sample from its surface, and bring it back to the Earth for scientific analysis.
OREX has descended below the 5-meter mark. The hazard map is go for tag.
And we have touchdown!
And on September 24th of 2023, that capsule landed in the Utah desert, and I could finally start to think about the amazing science that we were going to get in addressing some of the deepest questions that we ask ourselves. Where did we come from? And I went back to our original proposal, and I read the line that said, analysis of this material will provide unprecedented knowledge about the origin of life. And I thought, how am I going to do that? So I went to work. I started reading through the scientific literature, and I came across a paper called The Quantum Origin of Life. And I looked at the author, and it was somebody named Stuart Hameroff. And I got online, and I researched him, and I was like, he's at the University of Arizona. He's literally right across the street from my office. I emailed him right away. I said, we need to talk, and we set up our first meeting.
Hey, Dante.
Hey, Stuart, how you doing? Come on in. We got some exciting new results from the OSIRIS-REx samples. What I came to realize is he's talking about life using quantum information to give it an evolutionary advantage. And if that's the case, could that be the secret to the origin of life? The first biomolecules arose out of the din of the chemical background because they were able to process quantum information. Going up and around, and you get these little cores inside the serpentine, the clay minerals. When we look at the samples from the asteroid, what jumps out is when you hit them with an ultraviolet light, they are fluorescent. They're capturing those photons and they're releasing it back as visible light. That right there is a quantum process. It looks like a galaxy full of stars. We've got all the nucleobases, all the letters of the genetic code are in this asteroid sample. We have an enormous number of amino acids, including the ones that are central to the quantum information in these microtubule proteins, the aromatic amino acids. And there's 3 of them, phenylalanine, tyrosine, and the one everybody's familiar with, tryptophan. And it seems like tryptophan is the secret ingredient there. It's the most complex amino acid. It has a double ring. It can enter into multiple quantum states, and it has a very familiar structure. It's at the center of all the major psychedelic compounds. They all have that indole ring, which is central to the tryptophan amino acid. And I was like, okay, well, that's a clue. So the red in that map is just telling you the distribution of carbon. And so what I started to talk about with Stuart is maybe life and consciousness might be 2 sides of the same coin. Right, exactly. That's why these molecules might start to self-organize. Now all of a sudden they have agency. You think we could test the consciousness first theory?
Yeah, we could then see if the fluorescence is inhibited by anesthesia proportional to anesthetic potency.
One of the things that
Pretty remarkable. It's worth noting, or perhaps repeating, that microtubules, like everything, are physical structures derivative of organized information contained in the quantum field. It's even more notable that objects such as microtubules, which are themselves derivative of quantum field information, process and utilize said quantum information to drive survival and evolution in simple and complex creatures. I believe that the idea that life developed as a vehicle for the expression of quantum information, which not only codes for survival but for evolution, accounts for our innate tendency as human beings to aspire and to grow and to realize our full potential. Now, let's flesh out the idea of information transfer. You remember the Dispenza change model discussed earlier. New information leads to new thoughts, etc. As we've seen, information in the most fundamental sense of the word underlies everything, including the unified field system we've been exploring thus far. Again, the rules by which the field system operates are also defined by information. I'd like to focus on the idea of information transfer, though, for just a moment. It may be helpful to think of yourself as the person on the right of the screen as I'm reading and me on the left, or just close your eyes, use your imagination, and try to follow along as I read an excerpt from chapter 11 of my book, in which I attempt to illustrate an example of quantum information transfer. Here we go. Quote, "Consider for a moment the letters that make up the words on the pages of this book. The letters consist of microscopic dots, ink molecules sprayed onto the pages of the paper, which is composed of paper molecules, all of which are composed of atoms, which in turn consist of subatomic particles. Each subatomic particle is derivative of perturbations or excitations in one of the 3 respective fields from which everything we see originates: electron, up quark, down quark. The letters, the words, sentences, and ink on the page are being perceived by your brain, which is derivative of the same field system as this book. The neurons that synthesize the ideas contained herein, those in my mind or my brain, are derivative of the self-same fields that comprise you, the book, the ink, etc. This is a closed system consisting of author, content, media, and reader, all of which are epiphenomena of the same continuous field system, regardless of when or where in the world you're reading this. Given this, one could ask, why not just leave out the middleman? Why is a book even needed? The information was always present within the fields, so why don't I just know all this stuff like the author does? The fields need not have organized themselves into subatomic particles comprising the microtubules and neurons in my brain, which fired in such a manner that I ultimately came up with the content of this book. Remember, my brain and its neurons are derivative of the exact same fields that your brain is. Throughout the entire author, content, and reader system, the quantum fields are the common denominator permeating the subjective reader, you, the subjective author, me, and the objective media by which the information is being conveyed between us. We are all inextricably connected by the fields of and through which we and everything in the universe exists. The fields are continuous, indivisible, and are the fundamental elements upon which all of reality is built." Unquote. I think we have differing subjective experiences because our physical bodies are severely limiting factors. We possess dual citizenship between the material and the immaterial aspects of ourselves, but over time most of us have come to over-identify with the material side of the equation, although it constitutes, again, less than 1/1,000,000% of who we are. Just for fun, let's have a quick look at an example of how consciousness, or directed energy with intent, materially impacts our external environment. Information transfer need not only be between our ears, between people or other sentient beings. Check this out.
And Mr. Masuro Emoto. Mr. Emoto became terribly interested in the molecular structure of water and what affects it. Now, water is the most receptive of the 4 elements. Mr. Emoto thought perhaps it would respond to non-physical events. So he set up a series of studies, applied mental stimuli, and photographed it with a dark field microscope. This first picture is a picture of water from the Fujiwara Dam. And this picture is the same water after receiving a blessing from a Zen Buddhist monk. Now, in this next series of pictures, Mr. Emoto printed out words, taped them to bottles of distilled water, and left them out overnight. This first photograph is a picture of the pure distilled water, just the essence of itself. These subsequent photographs, as you can see, are each different. This is the chi of love. And we move along here to thank you. And you can see where he taped that to this bottle here. But if you read Japanese, you already knew that. Now, Mr. Emoto speaks of the thought or intent being the driving force in all of this. The science of how that actually affects the molecules is unknown, except to the water molecules, of course. And it's really fascinating when you keep in mind that 90% of our bodies are water.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? If thoughts can do that to water, imagine what our thoughts can do to us.
An important point in that clip is that although the conductor of the experiment shown utilized Japanese, it is the meditative or conscious intent that accounts for the material impact on the water crystals. This experiment has been successfully reproduced in many laboratories in different language-speaking countries with similar results. Furthermore, distance has no meaning in terms of the impact of directed conscious energy. Numerous double-slit experiments have been conducted remotely with meditators focusing on a lab apparatus on the other side of the planet with statistically relevant results. Intent is, in fact, a field-based phenomenon, and it's my belief that intent is the true universal language. Consciousness, directed energy with intent, has the same material impact within our brains. Self-directed energy works within the field system localized between our ears as quantum information transfer occurs internally or takes place through interaction with our physical environment. Remember that first video we saw? Let's now watch it through the prism of the new information provided today, not from the perspective of psychologists or neurologists, but rather from the perspective of quantum physicists and prospective practitioners of biofield therapy. Remember, neurons and microtubules are comprised of organic molecules, which are formed from multiple atoms, all of which are organized from quarks and electrons, which in turn are derivative of the scalar fields, behavior of which is governed by the vector fields, and all of which are ultimately defined by quantum information. So, what we're about to witness is direct physical evidence of consciousness-driven information transfer in action, aka cognitive restructuring.
Synaptic connections. Every time you learn something new, this is what's happening in your brain, geniuses. If you learned one bit of information today, your brain did this. Boom. That's learning. Physical evidence as a result of your interaction in the environment. Every time you learn something in your brain, there's a physical change that takes place, and learning is making new connections. Are you with me? This is how fast it happens, too. That's learning. If you learn anything this week, you've made a footprint. If learning is making new synaptic connections, then if you keep firing the same thoughts over and over again, you're going to wire them in your brain. So then if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining them. And all of a sudden, they develop a long-term relationship. And just like any relationship, the more you communicate, the more they connect. And neurons are exactly the same way. Now, as you begin to learn information,
this is what cognitive restructuring is. It also happens to be what has been occurring the entire time you've been sitting through this presentation, both as the information has been flowing from me to you, but also as your own consciousness has been working out some of the implications for this new information, either consciously or unconsciously. You may recall early on that I said I believe that the most important aspect of the Dispenza change model is information. When we introduce and reinforce our patients' understanding of this new information on the nature of reality and thus themselves, we impact their thoughts and their brain begins rewiring, taking this new information into account, which is what neuroplasticity is like. Interestingly, the body, including the brain, doesn't know the difference between a real and a well-imagined experience. This being the case, my clinical model utilizes a supersized solution-focused exercise that I call the magic wand thought experiment, whereby cognitive restructuring is facilitated via what I'd say is the doing part of biofield therapy. This involves guided mental rehearsal or meditation on their unique vision during which they occupy their imagined ideal reality as though it were occurring in the present. After just one session of this intensive mindfulness approach, their perceptions begin to change noticeably as their brains rewire. Continued application of these mindfulness exercises results in faster outcomes versus more traditional approaches to psychotherapy, which increases buy-in and a desire to seek more new information. Over time, patients' outer world begins to reflect their inner world, and they're no longer believe that they are victims of their circumstances, but rather the creators thereof. And with continued practice and consequent feedback from their environment, they eventually embody and physiologically identify as a person with an inherent sense of spirituality and connection, both of which are conducive to a strong depth of recovery, as we know. Here are some examples of information I try to instill in my patients, all of which are based on the underlying science. And they're in the book and in the slides provided in the conference application if you have access to that. I will leave them up here for just a minute. You can always go back to this part of the presentation if you want, or you can get them out of the book. All right, I'm going to move on. So how does this material fit into helping our patients recover from addiction and related mental health issues? I've laid out a hierarchy here with the most authentic states being the foundation of their being. Once they identify as essentially physical expressions of consciously organized quantum information, we build on that and then we put their pathology into context. So with that in mind, at level 1, level 2 represents day 0, the day that they're born, their most authentic state of material being before all the fun starts. Their social context is then defined by their caregivers, usually a dysfunctional family of origin, which includes adverse childhood experiences. It's here where they learn to repress their true self in order to maintain attachment to their dysfunctional parents in a form of pure adaptation, which is at odds with its other survival need as defined by the aforementioned quantum information, which includes the desire to realize their full potential. Gabor Mate correctly states that discrepancy between the need for authenticity and self-realization on one hand and the need for attachment on the other is the root cause of all emotional pathology. Self-repression causes resentment towards self and others. It causes self-directed anger, shame, and low self-esteem. As a result, next level up, mental health issues such as anxiety, the feeling of walking on eggshells around those that the patient is fearful of losing, in other words, fear of abandonment, depression, and personality traits such as people-pleasing start to infect relational dynamics between the patient and those with whom they have relationships. People who, as they get older, feel familiar to them regardless of their level of dysfunction. Many, of course, then adopt addictions to self-medicate the mental health pathology that they developed as a survival mechanism to deal with their dysfunctional families of origin. And eventually they present to us as their best thinking proved inadequate to resolve their relational or life problems. So our job as clinicians is to help patients work back down through those layers of pathology to find and recover their most authentic selves and to become a more fully realized, authentic, and unapologetic version of their true selves if we're going to align with quantum information that seems to push us in that direction. A clinician pondering the implementation of biofield therapy might say, wow, this is great, but gosh, it would take forever for someone to internalize and then begin applying these concepts in their life. The fact of the matter is that you've all already been applying these concepts to yourselves your entire lives. You just haven't been aware of it. Think about it. For better or for worse, your life currently represents the cumulative effects of every thought that you've ever had as it manifested into choices, behaviors, emotions, and so on. Every conscious or subconscious doubt you've ever had about what's either possible or impossible for you has informed your choices, your behaviors, experiences, and emotions, yielding the life you have now, and this will continue. We need not, however, like our patients, be facing jail time or the abandonment of loved ones or existential despair to realize that our thoughts and unquestioned beliefs have likely limited us or created a gap between where we are and where we intuitively believe we could be in terms of things like our professional advancement, our finances, relationships, our physical aspirations, or our overall happiness. You now have the ability to put this information to the test for yourself and see what happens. Shameless plug. As mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, this information, along with 36 hours of corresponding supporting media, are available in my book, Resolving Spiritual Skepticism and Recovery, which is available from Amazon in either Kindle or hard copy format. Kindle's nice because it's immediate and it's easy to search for keywords and phrases, but some like the feel of a book, so I get that. I do offer in-person and remote presentations such as this one for Lunch and Learns, as well as clinical track curriculum for individuals, facilities, and group practices. I also offer in-person 2 or 3-day workshops with clinical note templates to treatment facilities that can be done over a weekend if necessary to unburden clinical staff for other opportunities. And finally, I also have a workbook available to facilitate biofield therapy within group or individual settings. I appreciate your time and look forward to hearing from you. My contact information is in the QR code below if you choose to scan that. Thank you for your attention.